You're listening to Little Green Cheese, episode 45. Well, welcome to the Little Green Cheese podcast. I'm Gavin Weber, and this is where you can learn about cheese making at home. Now, the question of the week was about curd cutting or cutting your curd. And why does the size matter? Now, this was from one of my customers from Little Green Workshops, and she called out in desperation and asked why are my curds all sloppy. She was making a Feta cheese at the time, and I had to ask her what she actually did. She had coagulated the cheese, coagulated the milk, so it had set. She'd cut it, and then straight from there, she had poured it into her cheesecloth, and it went all sloppy, and then she couldn't figure out why. Now, that's all fine because, I've done that before myself when I first started making cheese. And so let's talk about the reason why we cut our cheese, and then what size we cut it and why we cut it the size we do, and why we then cook the curds. And cooking basically means heating the curds to a specific temperature as specified in the recipe to expel as much whey as we can. So the main reason that we cut rennet coagulated cheeses, cut the curd for that cheese, we want to cut it into the same size pieces and shape, hopefully. So when you cut the curd smaller, the resultant cheese tends to be a lot drier. If you cut the curds larger, you end up with a moister cheese. So the cutting patterns, I normally cut in a cubed pattern, and you've probably seen that on many of my YouTube videos. And if you haven't seen that, just pop over to the Cheese Videos tab on littlegreencheese.com and pick any of the semi-hard cheeses, and you can see that I'm using a curd knife and I'm cutting in a cube pattern. Basically what I'm doing is, according to the recipe, cutting it diagonally, horizontally. I'm cutting it vertically in a crosshatch sort of manner. So I do one side and then turn it diagonally and then cut the other side, and then I cut at a 45-degree angle to get the horizontal cuts. So when I do cut, though, I usually say in the recipe what the curd size, what the cubed size should be. So when I'm cutting, say, Parmesan, then I'll cut it down to about it's about 1/4 of an inch, which is, what's that in metric? That's about 6 millimeters. So 6 millimeters. And what I also do with Parmesan is I use a balloon whisk and I push that up and down to make the grains rice-sized, basically. Not right away, but as small as I possibly can without making the curd all mushy. And then as I stir it, as I cook it to a higher temperature, up to about 52 degrees with Parmesan, if I remember rightly, it then shrinks down to rice-sized curd pieces. However, when I'm making something like Feta, I cut the cube size a lot bigger because it is a moister cheese. So I cut it to about 15 mil, which is about 1/2 an inch. So, and then I have to stir it. So once you've cut your curd and you've got it to the right size, and hopefully to every curd cube the same sort of size, then we stir it and we cook the curd. So to create and we make sure we have a uniform temperature. So we'll usually start off around between 30 and 32 degrees Celsius, and depending on the recipe, we may need to increase the temperature of the cheese up to about 35. And when you're using that's when you're using a mesophilic culture. But when you're using a thermophilic culture and you're doing the hard Italian cheeses, then you'll need to go up to around about between 48 and 52 degrees Celsius. And as you do that, and the amount of time you stir the curds, you'll find that the curds shrink and they expel whey. So the process of expelling the whey is called, let me say this, syneresis, spelled Syneresis. The curd has a natural tendency to contract and to expel the whey. But as I said, you've got to stir it, you've got to increase the temperature, and it's the length of time depends on how much of the whey expels from the curd. If you cut the curd too small for your desired cheese, you'll end up with a dry, hard cheese when you're probably looking for something that's a little bit better than that. So basically that's why we cut curd and why we cut it down to the different sizes. Sizes, as I mentioned, can range from anywhere between 6 millimetres to 25 millimetres, which is about a quarter of an inch up to about an inch. With cheddar is a good example. That's about a centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. So those So to get those sizes evenly, what I basically do if I'm making any sorts of cheddars that require about a centimetre, and a fair few of my cheeses I use my curd cutter that was specifically made for cutting curds 1 centimetre in size. So I get the same result every single time over and over, which is really good for the cheeses that I make because I get a very similar result each and every time because I've cut them exactly the same size. So that's why it's important to cut your curds, and it's also important to stir your curds and cook them so they expel the right amount of whey. So now it's time for the news, and I've got some local news here. I live in the city of Greater Melbourne here in Victoria, Australia, and there happens to be a couple of cheese festivals that are on. So the first one I'm going to mention is on the 24th of October, and that is the Paran Market Cheese Festival. I think it goes from, it says there's some stuff starting at 12. I think it'll be before then, so about between 10 and 2. There's some displays, and there's going to be free cheese tastings and samples during the day from all of their deli operators, including cheese providers such as Calendar Cheese, Red Cow, and King Island Dairy. So that's something to look forward to. I'm going to pop along there with my son and see what sorts of things are going there and see if I can sample some new cheeses. And then after I've done that, I'll figure out if I can find the recipe and try and replicate that here at home. It's always good to have a go at new cheeses. So I'm going to pop over to the Paran Market Cheese Festival on the 24th of October, which is a Saturday. So I'm going to go and check that out. The next one is the Williamstown, again in Melbourne, Williamstown Wine and Cheese Festival. So that's on the 25th of October, so the following day from the Paran Cheese Festival. And they're going to show people how to make cheese, and there's going to be lots of cheese tasting and obviously lots of wine tasting as well. That actually has a cost to it. I think it's $25 a head. There's live music, cheese making, cheese tasting, the whole lot. So you can go to wineandcheesefest.com.au and check out the information on the Wine and Cheese Festival. So that's the local news here. If any of my listeners have any cheese festivals that they'd like to promote on the podcast, I'll happily do that free of charge. So send through the details via email. You can contact me on my contact page at littlegreencheese.com. Send it through. Doesn't matter where it is in the world because I have listeners from all over the globe, which is fantastic. Now, one final piece of news. I have a cheese-making course, a mozzarella and ricotta workshop, and that's occurring on the 18th of October here in Melton. So the details for that are over at littlegreencheese.com, and you just click through the Cheese Workshops tab, and you'll go over to Little Green Workshops, and there's some booking details there. It's a lovely little course. It goes for 3 hours. You get to make mozzarella yourself, but I talk through basic cheese making principles, and I show a demonstration of ricotta. And then afterwards, we break out some French bread, and we chomp down on the mozzarella. It's a fantastic, great little course. I enjoy teaching it. So, like I said, the details are over at littlegreencheese.com. Okay, so that's the news for the episode. Rightio, now we've got the question section of the show, and the first question is from Shelly. Now, I'm not sure where Shelly is from, but she says, "Hi Gavin, I've been following your cheese making tutorials and have made a few cheeses from your recipe book. I have waxed the cheddars and will follow your guide of waxing the Parmesan after a month. I vacuum sealed the halloumi, and I am wondering how long Feta lasts when vacuum sealed. Have you any suggestions, as would prefer to store it that way to limit the salt penetration through the cheese, as my husband has high blood pressure and follows a low salt diet. It probably won't last long anyway, but I would still like to know." Okay, thanks for your question, Shelley. Appreciate it. Yeah, so Feta. So backpacking Feta should be pretty easy. I would brine it for a day, just to make sure that it does absorb enough salt, but then don't leave it in the brine. So take it out. I would just pat it dry with paper towel, just to make sure there's no excessive moisture on the cheese. And then I would just simply put it into the Vacpack plastic bag and suck all the air out. Look, it'll last for at least 6 months in that container. Easy. I've got cheese that I've had vac-packed for over a year now, easy. And once I crack it open, it is perfect. It is exactly the same as the day I vacuum packed it. Once you exclude all the oxygen, the cheese doesn't develop or doesn't mature any further in flavour, and it has the same taste as it went in. So if you do want to have a fairly lightly salted Feta, then that's the best way to do it. So after about 24 hours, you've got to make sure there's some salt in there so it's preserved, and then vacuum pack it. But you can experiment if you think you could get away with 12 hours. Depends on the size of the Feta. If you're making an 8-litre batch of Feta, so doubling the recipe that I have in the Keep Calm and Make Cheese, the Beginner's Guide to Cheese Making at Home, if you use my ebook or book, then make sure that that calls for 4 litres of milk. So if you double it, just make sure that you double the amount of time that you're putting it in the brine. So hopefully that helps, and thanks so much for your question, Shelley. So the next question is from Judy. Judy says, "Thank you for your books and videos. I refer to them whenever cheese making. My problem is that the blue cheese is so delicious, but is also so runny and quite slumped. It exudes thin liquid when in the fridge, wrapped in cheese paper, and really not much blue visible. I vary humidity when ripening between 50 and 85%, but results are consistent. I really value any suggestions. Thank you for all your efforts you put into helping us and the planet." Judy. Thank you very much, Judy. I think you're referring to the Greenie and Gavin blog that I also run over there. But look, I think I can help. What I do is that when I'm making my blue cheese, it does go runny sometimes, but what I've managed to do over the last few times is that I wrap it in aluminium foil now, and that's just the outside. So that's the cylindrical part, and leave the two ends open. And when the two ends start to form a form of looks like blue slime, I just pull that off with a knife. So just scrape it off as you would scraping a piece of wood. So I just scrape that off and then let it continue to age. And I find that way the cheese still stays moist, but it doesn't go all gooey. It's the ends that usually go gooey, and I find that by pulling that off, it ages quite well. And I still keep it in its maturation box, and it sits at about 90% relative humidity, and I find that I get fairly decent results. The odd time that I forget to turn it or something like that, it may go a little bit gooey on the end, but then what I do, I just make a blue cheese sauce with the bits I've scraped off, and it is absolutely delicious, and continue to let the cheese mature in the ripening box. And then I wrap it up with micro cheese wrap and then let it mature and then store it in the fridge. Or I have been known to also vacuum pack the blue cheese, and it stores for quite a long time, and there's no further Penicillium roqueforti activity within the cheese. But yeah, I would pierce it as per my recipe, which is after about the 4 days of turning, then pierce it again at about the 15-day mark, and then you'll find that you'll have more blue lines through your cheese as well. Well, thanks, Judy. Thanks very much for your email. The next one is it's more of praise than anything else. This one's from Mark. Mark says, "Hi, Gavin. I think you have some of the best cheese making videos on the internet. You are a great teacher. Keep it going. Keep making cheeses. P.S. Could you make a cottage cheese video? I think it would be fantastic. Thank you, Mark." Well, Mark, I'm going to add it to the list. So far on my list, as I've said, hang on, I'll just find it here. So I've got Havarti on my list. I've got Gouda with cumin, and now I have cottage cheese. Just writing that down so I don't forget. Okay, so I have a couple of free weekends coming up soon, and now it is springtime. It is perfect weather for making cheese here at home. It's not too cold, it's not too hot. So, yeah, I'm going to spend a whole weekend making cheeses and recording the videos, so there should be a bit of a glut of those coming out soon. But thanks very much, Mark, for your praise and your suggestion for a cheese-making video. The next one is a bit of a long one. This one's from Scott, and Scott doesn't say where he's from, but he talks about he's a new cheese maker, but a long-time home brewer, and he sees a lot of parallels between the two hobbies, particularly in the area of sour and wild beer styles. It brings me to a bit of a strange question that I'm having problems finding an answer to. In the beer world, beer styles originally developed in a particular location based on the grains grown in the area, malting techniques, and the microflora in the air. Over time, these regional specialties were refined, techniques and cultures were shared around the world, and as such, we have beer styles we know today. I imagine the same thing would be more or less true of cheese. Styles developed based on what kind of milk was available, what those animals were eating, microflora in the air, and locally developed methods of processing the curd. I'm having a real issue finding information about how these styles developed in their given areas. Would you know anything about it? Perhaps a history of cheese would make an interesting podcast or two. Scott, I definitely think it would, and I've been giving it some thought. And I'm going to research the history of a couple of the, well-known cheeses that people make at home and find out how they were originally developed, if I can figure it out. Some of the cheeses, especially the Italian ones, date back way back to Roman times, so it may be quite difficult to find out how they originally first made these cheeses. But, some of the local history around cheddars and stuff like that, I'm sure I can dig up and do the intro of the podcast anyway. I like the format, how it is, having question time at the end. But, yeah, certainly I'll have a look at that. Now, what I will do is he's got 2 other questions, so I'm going to leave that for this show. I don't want it to ramble on too much. But thanks very much, Scott, and I appreciate you sending in that question, and we'll do part 2 in the next episode. Well, that's all about we've got for this week. Keep listening. There's going to be lots more cheese podcasts here on Little Green Cheese. And as I mentioned before, I am teaching a cheese making workshop here in Melton. So anybody who's local in Victoria, Australia, or the greater Melbourne area, then look up the course details over at littlegreencheese.com and click on the Cheese Workshops tab, and you'll get the information on how to book that. and the cost. But thanks for listening, everybody. For upcoming workshop dates, recipes, and my YouTube videos, you can find all of those over at littlegreencheese.com. You can also find my ebook, Keep Calm and Make Cheese, the Beginner's Guide to Cheese Making at Home, and that's available at all ebook formats. Now, for Australian readers or listeners, you can actually buy a hardback. Well, it's a hardback, it's a booklet that I put together. And if you pop over to littlegreenworkshops.com.au and go to the book section, you can find Keep Calm and Make Cheese in a booklet form, which is very informative for everybody. You can also find all my cheese making products, kits, supplies and equipment over at littlegreenworkshops.com.au for all those of you in Australia and New Zealand. Yes, we do ship our products over to New Zealand as well. Well, thanks for listening, Curd Nerds, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Little Green Cheese Podcast. During this podcast, you heard royalty-free music by Kevin MacLeod. I played Malt Shop Bop, News Theme, and Call to the Dairy Cows. Bye.